Thank you very much, and thank you, Paolo and Lear, for putting together this very interesting conference. It's a really sort of pleasure and honor to be here to talk about vertical restraints. So let me just preview this by saying when Paolo and Emilio approached me to talk about these issues, I said, look, I've done work on vertical restraints, mainly in brick and mortar or offline context. I haven't done any research on online world. What can I talk about? So with that ado, part of this, what I'm going to talk about is going to focus on what we, learned or remember from the offline world or the vertical restraints 1.0 world. And so what I would like to do as a primarily empirical researcher, focus more on the empirical knowledge rather than the theoretical knowledge, understanding that the literature, the academic literature on this is probably overpowered maybe 100 to 1 by theoretical as opposed to empirical works. Then what, I would like to make some very brief comments on the ebooks case, and maybe some even more preliminary and brief comments on the online travel situation, which I understand is a very active, issue, especially in Europe right now. And with the, disclosure that I am not party to any of these cases, so which has two effects. One is, I'm probably much less informed than people who are actually party to these cases, but also whatever I will say, I will say, what I think. So let me just talk about, vertical restraints in the offline world. Right, so the primary, what do vertical contracts do? Vertical contracts or integration are ways to align the incentives of upstream and downstream entities. Okay? And as such, right, when we align incentives of different parties, a lot of times this is to increase the efficiency of that productive coalition. Right? Marriage is a contract. We think that improves efficiency of household production in some ways. Right? So in that sense, seeing some sort of contractual arrangement as an impediment to competition or harming consumer surplus per se, it might not be the right place to start from. And then we have plenty of examples of this. Right? Better contracts lead to a removal of errors in, let's say, pricing policies. Take the case of double marginalization. Or more generally, alleviation of all sorts of hold-up or expropriation concerns of the contracting parties. Right? A lot of contracting situations are characterized by investments that need to be undertaken by the parties to increase the efficiency or the production of the coalition. Right? But the parties are not going to make these incentives unless they have some guarantee that they're going to get a return from this investment. And the contract is a way to divide the surplus and to enforce property rights of the contracting parties. So this is, in many ways, what people characterize as, the part of the Chicago view. But of course, the anti-competitive view is one that comes into a lot of scrutiny as well. Again, vertical contracts help align incentives upstream and downstream entities. But now the issue is, does alignment of incentives lead to decrease in the surplus of the parties who are not in this contract? Right? Are these contracts leading to some external harm? Okay. So now, of course, for you to tell that story, you have to have a good story of how this contractual arrangement is going to harm the third party. And in the antitrust situation, that's going to be the consumer. Right? And I guess the quote-unquote Chicago school was to say that, look, in many of the situations, one of the parties already possesses market power. So in a sense, they could extract all the surplus from the consumers the way that, by doing other things. This contract here that they propose to their downstream or upstream partner, who does not possess any market power, can only be because it's going to increase the efficiency of production or decrease the cost of doing this. So this is that one monopoly power doctrine saying, you cannot improve on the monopoly power that you already have by imposing a contract on top of it. All right? So all of the story is about vertical restraints leading to external harm have to somehow get around this critique. And there are of course a huge literature on sort of ways in which these contracts can go against the Chicago critique. For example, the resale price maintenance, most favorable nation contracts as sorts of commitment devices or coordination or collusion devices for the contracting parties, let's say, to collude on a price. Or take some of these contracts as giving the commitment power for the monopolist to be able to price discriminate or exercise market power, when in the absence of these contracts they couldn't commit to this. Many of these sort of game theoretic models that lead to harm from vertical restraints use this type of intuition to lead to this. So with foreclosure, sort of raising rivals cost type explanations as well. So, I mean, that's, I guess, the point that maybe, economists should be really emphasizing all around the world. In pretty much all interesting situations, both of these pro and anti-competitive forces do coexist. Hence, if you're going to be sort of rational about this, you have to apply a rule of reason in these contexts. And it's good to see many antitrust bodies sort of incorporating these things, rule of reason type approaches to vertical cases. Of course, you may worry in certain situations as to whether, the anti-competitive begins to dominate the pro-competitive. And some of these are reflected in guidelines, or formal or informal. You do care when sort of individual parties have market power. It's not obvious always, just taking concentration ratios might not always be the predictor of, potential harm. So you have to be a bit more subtle about it. The other is, the party that's being charged with anti-competitive conduct probably has to have a good story as to how the practice is enhancing efficiency, right? In the absence of this, it raises eyebrows as well. Another is sort of, the nature of downstream competition, presence of strategic complementarities, etc., may also raise concern for anti-competitive forces being at work. Okay. So this is sort of, I think, the theoretical landscape. So as I said, and I don't want to, of course, short shrift in theoretical literature. There's a huge theoretical literature on this. A lot of it's, again, construct counterexamples to the Chicago School sort of benchmark, if you will. What's the empirical knowledge on this? Okay. And by empirical, what I would like to say, maybe this is a too narrow view of what empirical means, but this is, I would say, the dominant empirical paradigm in economics these days. It's a more sort of statistical, large sample evidence that we're going to get. Right? So the dominant empirical paradigm of today is you have an outcome variable. It's a function of the conduct at question, say vertical relations or vertical restraints, controlling for a bunch of stuff and allowing for some unobservable factors, maybe that might be different, right? And, for these outcomes, we can put prices, quantities, entry, exit in the long and short run, investment. If you have measures, some sort of consumer welfare measures, that would be the way to do this, okay? Obviously, sort of what we're interested in is the comparison of the actual regime, but we implemented vertical restraints with a counterfactual regime where the vertical restraints are not implemented. That's the conceptually ideal experiment that we would like to have. Right? Controlling for all these factors. Unfortunately, as almost probably all of you know, in practice, this is one of the cases you're going to get this type of empirical approach. This type of empirical approach is going to be extremely difficult. A main reason is, vertical restraints are not randomly assigned to some markets and not to other markets, right? And if you read any court documents about how people, think about and negotiate these contracts, a lot of thought goes into this, and a lot of factors are incorporated into adoption of these types of restraints or contracts in these different situations. So at the end, credible empirical work needs some sort of plausibly exogenous drivers of vertical restraints. Okay. And I'll talk very briefly about some literature that tries to do this. Another is to look at before and after antitrust action on some of these policies. In that sense, the regulatory bodies are the economist's friend by introducing some sort of variation in this. But obviously, the decisions of the antitrust or regulatory authorities is not going to be completely exogenous to this situation either. Right? But maybe another sort of big challenge, and here's, maybe I'm happy to discuss this more. Maybe I'm going, on a thin line here. There is an issue with this dominant empirical approach, as I will show in some of the case studies in academic literature. Even if you do find some evidence that say, vertical restraints increases prices or decreases quantities or hurts entry, is this something we can generalize to other contexts other than this market? And I would say just the way we set up the theoretical problem, there is fundamentally going to be some issues that, a lot of things are going to be context specific that affects the extrapolation of results from one context to another. A lot of this, so in maybe econometricians' terms, the interaction effects of this alpha coefficient or this vertical restraints with some of the controlling factors there is going to be perhaps or even more important than the main effect in the regression. Okay. And maybe this, and if I were to speculate a little bit, maybe this fact limits the amount of empirical work that we've done in this area. Why there are 100 theoretical papers as opposed to for every one empirical paper in this literature. It's that, maybe we learn much more from individual case studies than sort of more large sample econometric type studies where we can test these hypotheses, as some of our other economics colleagues are trying to do in other contexts. Right, so again, just to say, in labor economics, for example, they run the regressions like these, and there the assumption is that every human is in some ways up to some controllable factors similar, but here we're dealing with very different markets potentially. Okay, so with that, let me just sort of discuss very briefly, and I should probably be cognizant of my time as well. Some of the studies that I personally really like in this literature. So one example I like to give this because it's also an example of a let's say, internet age disruption. So Julie Mortimer has, in her thesis, studied a disruption of the video rental industry. So those of you who remember the pre-Netflix days, right? So the movie would hit the theaters, and then it would come off the theaters, and then there would be some time before you could buy the video tape or DVD. You could go rent it from a rental shop. Or there would be also a rental market if you don't want to buy the DVD. So what used to be the practice before 1998 is that in the US, the movie distributors, for the first 6 months after the movie theater release ended, would charge a very high price per tape. Say something like $100 per videotape. The aim is to intertemporally price discriminate, and they would lower this to about $12 after 6 months so that consumers could buy it. But in the 6-month period, they want to restrict it to rental customers. But because every tape costs $100 for rental stores to buy, it was extremely expensive for them. Right? It was a risky thing to buy a lot of tapes. So what this disruptor did, the disruptor is a company called Rentrack. They said, well, why don't we put a barcode scanner in each video rental store and put stickers on the tapes and scan these things as they're rented out. With this way, we can monitor how many times the tape has been rented out, and we can implement a revenue sharing contract between the movie studio and the video rental store. So they introduced a monitoring device through their barcode and database system. Yeah. So what does this lead to? This leads to a dramatic decrease in rental prices and a really pretty dramatic increase in quantities of tapes that were sold across markets. So overall, this was a good disruption, if you will, by an IT provider and led to sort of increase in consumer welfare. Why? It made contracting easier. So this is a case where we have elimination of double marginalization due to a contractual improvement, leading to in many ways unquestionable increase in both producer and consumer welfare. So now, of course, removing double marginalization may be sort of a really obvious case. Why do these guys do it anyway? Aren't there better ways around it? Everybody's harmed by double marginalization. So we should, this should be a no-brainer. Let me talk about another much more recent paper by one of our University of Chicago students, who, by the way, wrote this as a second-year paper, which I think is a pretty good second-year paper. So what Alex McKay and David Smith did is they were trying to study the aftermath of the Legan decision in 2007, which basically was an RPM type case, and they said, okay, this has to be evaluated under a rule of reason standard. So what Alex and David noticed is that at the state level, the adoption of the rule of reason argument was varied. Some states followed the federal precedent immediately, but other states were delayed in doing this and still don't quite apply a rule of reason. They go more of a per se basis. So what they do in the study is and they want to study not just one market. There's another paper that looks at a single market. They want to study a lot of different markets. So they want to look at goods that are sold in supermarkets because there's a lot of price and quantity data for supermarket goods. So essentially what they do is, in the econometrics jargon, a difference in differences analysis. They look at states that allowed RPM under the rule of reason standard versus states that did not. And they show that in the states that allowed this thing, prices increased more than in states that did not. And you see sort of corresponding quantity declines in the sales of these goods as well. And this chart is basically one of the most sort of interesting of those. So this is the aggregate price index they construct across their 1,000 goods. So the black line, the solid line, is the rule of reason states. The broken line is the per se argument states, and controlling for other factors as well at the state level. So maybe there is some evidence about sort of the effects of the Legan decision. Obviously, as I said, this is a pretty preliminary paper. So they don't have data on actual resale price maintenance contracts. So this is quite an indirect assessment. It's just at the state level, it's not at the industry level. And also in this period that they analyzed, 2007 to 2009, you might say a lot of different things were happening. It's a period of a lot of macroeconomic turmoil, etc. You know, can we really extrapolate from this really weird period? And the other is, again, sort of, you know, is there something we can get from the cross-market variation from this? Right? There is some variation in the upstream and downstream concentration in these states, or these goods markets. Maybe we can learn something about this, rather than just saying RPM is bad or good for any market. They do some of these, but essentially a lot of these regressions, they don't yield much. So a lot of it sort of, you know, we don't get much significance from these results. Okay. So this is sort of, you know, what I want to say. So I'm going to skip now. I was going to talk about vertical mergers as well, but let me get to 2.0 as well. So I skipped a lot of slides there. What I want to say is, there's a bunch of studies like this on vertical mergers as well, you know, with mixed results. Some studies find that there is foreclosure, prices go up upon vertical merger. Other studies show prices go down, quantities go up, efficiency increases, investments increase. So we don't have much good sort of large-scale sort of econometric evidence on vertical mergers being good or bad either. Maybe sort of as you would expect from the theory, that it's really context specific. So now some very speculative remarks on the 2.0 world. So first, my main thought is not much is very different, right? There's one economics. What might be different in this context compared to the more brick and mortar settings that we study is that most of the current court battles especially are characterized by a traditional supply chain being disrupted by a platform or distribution channel that is subject to strong network effects. In the sense, this distribution channel, through network effects, could gain dominance in the downstream market. And this, of course, the people in the traditional supply chain, especially the retail arm, downstream arm, they don't like this. Of course, upstream too, whatever upstream market power they will have, they might have to share with the downstream, you know, monopolist that's going to be formed through these network effects, potentially. So my view is that a lot of the disputes are mainly about division of producer rents. Or maybe, you know, in some ways, sort of, who's going to put the docket, who's going to make the complaint, who has the resources to make the complaint, it's going to be the producers. You know, consumers are, in a sense, the excuse given to fight this battle in court. Obviously, sort of, as the regulatory body or the antitrust agency, we have to take somewhat the consumer perspective here. You know, we have to discuss whether this disruption is going to lead to strong efficiency gains without all gains being captured and more by the winner of this dispute. I think that's going to be the main question that to be decided. So as a case study, this Apple versus DOJ case on ebooks. So briefly to review, what happened there is that, so Amazon was the main conduit for ebooks for a long while because they have the Kindle. You can buy books on Kindle and people can read ebooks. But Amazon was charging very low prices, according to publishers. They were charging $10 per book. And the publishers were saying, look, that is way too low, because when consumers compare that price with our hardcover prices, which might be $30, they're going to say, okay, this is not a good deal to buy the hardcover, so we're going to read more ebooks. And they were concerned that in the long run, Amazon was going to become the dominant retail channel for books and going to completely disintermediate the publishers themselves and contract directly with the authors. So in comes Apple with his iPad, and iPad wants to add an iBook store. And iPad, sort of, I guess, the executive there has a bright idea. He knows he wants to get good deals with the publishers, but understands the pain point of the publishers, that they're really not happy with Amazon's low prices. So he says, well, why not we're going to enter, we can charge higher prices, but also introduce an MFN clause so that Amazon cannot undercut us in the ebooks market. We don't want the iBook store to look like the expensive alternative to Kindle. We want this to work. So Apple enters into the ebook market with MFN clauses with 5 of the 6 large publishing houses. The publishers go to Amazon saying, okay, we have this MFN clause with Apple, we're going to switch to agency contracts with you as well. And upon Apple's entry, prices go up by 18%, by certain books up by more. Doesn't take too long for the DOJ and others, probably Amazon involved as well, to sue Apple and 5 publishers to conspire to raise prices. And, a lot of the publishers, they settle almost right away. Others take a little more while. And, Apple is the only non-settling party that, is found guilty at the end. And this is the chart that in the decision document that the judge cites. She says, this was made by an Apple expert. This is April 10th when the iBook store is announced. The prices go up, from before of the ebooks by all publishers, except for Random House, which was not party to the agreement with Apple, but later on switched to an agency contract as well. And the chart actually doesn't show when Random House switched as well. Okay? So what happens at the end of the DOJ lawsuit, you see one of my former PhD students, Barbara de los Santos and Matthijs Wildermuis, have a new paper. They look at the prices upon the decision of the DOJ and the settlement. What they find here is that and they have a nice research design in the sense that different publishers settled at different dates. So they want to establish some sort of causality here. As you can see, after the dates that are imposed, the settlements of each of these publishers, the prices of the ebooks do decline after the agency contract and the MFN clause is lifted off. And they go back to a wholesale model with Amazon. Okay. So now the issue is, is the vertical restraints here, the agency plus MFN contracts, is this really bad? Right? So let's read a bit more. So in this particular data, in the short run, right, it's very hard to make the case that consumers were hurt by the DOJ decision. Right? So indeed, it's very hard to make also the efficiency gain argument here for the agency contract. That, okay, the wholesale model is subject to some double marginalization problem, but if the agency contract is solving that, then we should see actually prices declining, quantities increasing. But this is the opposite happened. Moreover, it's also interestingly, the district court also treated this as a per se price fixing case, rather than a rule of reason vertical case. Because they said, look, Apple was coordinating prices around these 3 different pricing tiers with these publishers. And a lot of the communication was about coordination on this price. So this is a price fixing case, even though Apple is not the price fix, is not the one really, is not one of the sellers of this, but nevertheless benefits from this somehow. So I guess the issue is, I think in the short run, definitely perspective, I do agree with the DOJ's, I think decision, the district court's decision as well, We do have to think about the long run as well in some of these situations. And there were some con-arguments in this way as well. If you look at some of Apple's objections, the last one was about the long-run effects of this. Well, they said, look, you're eliminating one of the ways an entrant come into the book distribution business. And this sets a bad precedent. The court says, we recognize that maybe Amazon was doing some sort of limit pricing, or they were charging things too low to gain dominance in the in intermediation sector, but that's the job of another court. You have to file a different complaint for that. This is not our job right now. So Justin Johnson has a paper, that made that point theoretically, that maybe Amazon's strategy is to lock in consumers for the long run, and then they were going to jack up prices when they gain dominance, etc. So is there any evidence for that? Well, so one is, if you want to take the con view, you can say, well, easily we can reject this, because look at what happened, Amazon prices, after the iPad introduction, they're still low. Okay, now Amazon faces a lot of competition. It is clear that they're not going to become dominant, so now they should go back to rational or short-term rational prices. But they still didn't do that. But if you want to take the yes view, you can say, look, it's been a while and iBookstore has never become a real competitor to Amazon. Their market share, and I don't have much good data about this. I was talking briefly with Joshua earlier. Just by casual observation on the plane, nobody was using their iPad to read a book. Everybody was using a Kindle to read a book. So maybe there is something about the downstream competition leading to a leader in Amazon. So what I would say here is, again, this is a case where it's complicated, let's say, trade-off between the short run and the long run. And unfortunately, in a lot of the situations, we never get to see the long run. Okay. So I'm not sure how much time I have left, but is it over? So let me just say, let me go to sort of airlines and search aggregators a bit. So again, sort of in the travel context as well, I think what's being done is it's some sort of, again, battle for the producer surplus. Airline and hotel cases are interesting comparisons in the sense that the battle now being fought between, in the hotel case, was fought in the airline case earlier. That there were the search aggregators in the airline case, and the airlines threatened to take off their listings from airline, aggregation sites. And they, pretty much by and large succeeded. And airlines now, from what I understand, have pretty good have established good brand names for their websites, and more people are going directly to airlines' websites as opposed to going through a search aggregator. I mean, Kayak has remained one of the important search aggregators there. But it has been a situation where the original distributors wrested control from the downstream disruptor, if you will. Hotels, on the other hand, of course, it's going to be another case because hotels are much more dispersed. The aggregators potentially have a lot more value to add to consumer search process by aggregating hotel offerings under one platform. Okay. That said, hotel chains by themselves are trying very hard to build their own online brands. Maybe we'll expect even more consolidation under brand umbrellas or other types of hotel-led aggregators to compete against the hotel aggregator. One thing I should say is that the rate parity type arguments that are being fought here in many ways rings very similar to the arguments in the Apple eBooks case. Right? So the Booking.com case or the Expedia case about the MFN clauses leading to uniform prices in many ways sounds very similar to the eBooks case, but the treatment of this online travel situation with the eBook situation is very different across the US courts. Right? In the Apple case, the court said this is price fixing. In the case of Expedia, they said, they threw out the price fixing complaint. So now I guess the ball is in Europe's court, and I guess that's being sort of discussed right now. But again, we do not have a good before versus after to study the short and long run effects of these contracts from the empirical point of view. So just to conclude, I tried to hit maybe 2 main points here, but again, just want to emphasize, vertical cases are difficult. In that case, they make them interesting and probably also is a good employment opportunity for economists because they have inherently pro and anti-competitive effects. Empirics, we do have body of evidence, unfortunately, for both types of effects. It's very hard to generalize to a consensus view to write a good, let's say, merger guideline, if you will, in the vertical case. So the rule of reason or case-by-case approach is pretty well justified. In the 2.0 case, I don't think there's that different from the bricks and mortars world. But I would like to caution sort of anybody party to these to really think maybe about the long-run consequences and not just the short-run consequences. And, we will continue to see some very interesting cases and conceptual challenges in the years to come.